everybody. Welcome back to the Brando and Joe podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Richard Landers. He received his PhD in IO-psychology from the University of Minnesota, is a very established researcher in the field, and currently serves as the president for Landers Workforce Science. Welcome, Richard. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, we're super glad you're able to talk with us today. I feel like the last time we spoke was over email, and you were coming back from Poland, was it, for some conference?
Yeah. European Association of Work and Org Psych was in Katowice, Poland this last year. They have a conference in a random part of Europe every 2 years.
Is it like a PSYOP but in Europe, basically, or is it? Are there
Yeah,
things that go on?
that's a good way to think about it. Yeah, there's actually like a larger coordinating organization called the Alliance, which is PSYOP plus EWOP plus a bunch of other national organizations. But yeah, it's a similar size. I think the conference is 3,000 people, so it's kind of PSYOP-y.
That's so funny. We were just, before we got started, we were saying the last time we kind of saw you around was just like over at PSYOP. So for you to kind of get that experience somewhere else, maybe Joe and I need to make a trip out to Poland next time.
Oh, it'd be so cool. I want to go.
It really moves all over. 2 years ago, it was in Turin, Italy, and this time was Katowice. They wanted to go to maybe it was 4 years ago. The pandemic got things weird. I know that they were supposed to be in Edinburgh, in Scotland, so they may be going there again because I think that's the one I think they missed because of the pandemic.
Oh, okay. And did you serve on any committees there, or present at all, or were you there as just like a member?
Yeah, no, I mean, I have a lot of European collaborators in research, so that's one of the easier ways actually to connect with all of them. Some of them make it to PSYOP, but not usually every year. So it's just a nice way to kind of have meetings with a bunch of different people and catch up.
Yeah, maybe I wonder if Hofstra will get us a membership to that one. Might have to work towards that.
We might have to do that on our own.
Yeah. But that's awesome. It sounds like you're super established and well known in this IO field. I wanted to get to kind of the bulk of our episode, talking about your consulting firm, kind of how you got started. So to kick things off, is this something that you thought of when you were going for your PhD in IO psychology? Is the consulting firm, was that even a part of your mind, or was that later on in your life?
Yeah, kind of. So I always liked the idea from even pre-grad school of being essentially a small business owner, having my own organization, being my own boss, that kind of thing. Consulting is an area that is, as pretty much anyone that does independent consulting will tell you, is not an area of very consistent income. So I didn't want to do that full time because I thought the stress would probably kill me. So it always was. After going to grad school, it was really in this is an eventual side gig kind of thing, and at that point, after graduating, it really became a lot easier after I got a little more established on the research side, because it's sort of a classic path. I don't know how many people do it anymore, but back in 30, 40 years ago, a lot of folks in academia would become pretty well established in a research program, and then they would start to kind of piggyback on that reputation to do consulting. And that's more or less the path I took too. So I do a lot of research in technology, so all my consulting is pretty much about technology.
That's really interesting, because we have had a lot of people on here who have done consulting, and so far you're the first one to kind of talk about building a path through research. And to do that, was that kind of in your mind, the, I guess, roadmap that you kind of followed because it's what you knew, you saw it in your past and you're like, okay, this is something that I could do?
Well, I mean, so technology is always something I wanted to do from a very early age. So I was one of those pulling apart my computer when I was a little kid and it stopped working and then I had to put it back together again kind of kids. Very, very nerdy, very, very nerdy kid. And so I originally actually wanted to go into computer science as a career field. And then that changed in college. But it's always been something that's kind of been a part of how I guess define myself in a way. It's just been core to my personal identity, being a tech guy. And so when I had the opportunity to pivot to that in research, I did that. And then after I started doing that, I saw the opportunities in consulting as well. There's also a little bit, kind of a more immediate impact of consulting than research. Like the research sort of gradually filters its way into practices, whereas the consulting is like immediate. So at least if you're in good consulting relationships. So I like that kind of blend. And that was a lot of what was attractive for me in pursuing it to begin with.
We always talk about just being like nerds in IO. We just did a student panel, and everyone's answer, I think we were talking about like people analytics or something like that.
Their favorite class.
Oh, that's what it was. And then someone goes down and we're like, we're all just nerds. And I was like, yeah, I guess so. It makes sense. But your research part of it into like the technology field, and if I'm not mistaken, you did some research in gamification too as well. In your research in gamification, is that something, because we kind of talked about it in one of our classes, having like meaningful gamification versus just having like random tasks assigned on like some training development program. What were some of like your findings? I know it's kind of broad, but like in your gamification research there, like you'd care to share?
Well, sure. So I'll go a little further back. So key to that nerdy identity I mentioned earlier is also a big time video gamer. So I'm, I was the kid that was, like that's the one that will never do anything with their life because all they do is sit at home and play video games, kid. So it's that also a key part of my identity. And I always wanted to work games, and also, just literally decades of experience with video games and turn that into something useful to society, I guess. So I saw in once I got into a position where I could do my own research and had more flexibility over what kind of topics I could pursue after getting to my first academic job, I started to think about, how can we proactively use games in a useful and interesting kind of way, in a way that actually takes advantage of the medium and not just throwing game methods and game terms into situations where they don't really belong. The core of games is about this motivational loop that you kind of find yourself in, where games now are more optimized for it. And years ago they were a little more wonky, but right now you can basically pick any game and pretty clearly see this core, what they call the core gameplay loop. That you start playing the game and you have these objectives and you meet some objectives and it leads to other objectives. And it's all about creating a meaningful experience as you progress through this cycle that just constantly repeats. And that's a lot like work. So we're often doing similar kinds of things, slightly different flavors and variations of it, but we're repeating the same basic activities over and over again at the very core of it. So trying to figure out how to apply game logic in that context became really important to me. And then I started, simultaneously with that, gamification started to become very popular. And it was also being done really badly, like horribly. In the early days, it was even worse than it is now. It's still not great, but there were, I remember seeing projects where, one of the ones that made the biggest impression on me was actually a gamification of a college classroom. And there's actually there's a study, like there's a paper you can read about this. And the way that they gamified this classroom environment, which would work just as well or not as well in training and development, is that they basically said, well, instead of exams, you're fighting monsters. And instead of getting points, you're going to make levels. And it's this very surface level understanding of what makes games engaging and interesting. And they're just kind of like borrowing that language and applying it somewhere else and saying, oh, well, now since I called your test a monster, you're going to be excited about it. Like it's that very shallow sort of like understanding of the psychology of games that meant that it doesn't really work very well. So a lot of my motivation and a lot of the work that we did has been about trying to figure out how to meaningfully take those lessons about creating engaging game mechanics and engaging gameplay loops and applying that into new contexts. So this is the meaningful gamification context that you actually identify with this sort of cycles and the processes that you've been placed into. But yeah, it's still done really badly a lot. So you can find many more examples of badly done games and gamification than well done ones in the corporate context, especially.
So, one question I have for you about that, continuing on that tangent of gamification, like, what are some of your personal favorites that you've kind of seen where they've been done well? Like, I know one thing we talked about in our class was like the app Duolingo, as something that
Hmm.
was really interesting, like an interesting form of gamification. So, what kind of examples have you seen in your like working world?
Yeah, we actually have a Duolingo study going on right now.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so those kind of systems, it's usually, even Duo is kind of a mix of good and bad features. So certain features in Duo are really more focused on repeated engagement. It's something that in the literature is referred to as dark patterns. It's this idea that you are trying to almost obligate or guilt a user into coming back and using your app. So that it's common and most common in free to play games, where you see these like free to play game apps. Like if you log in every day, you're going to get some gold or whatever. Like those kind of approaches are really about guilting a player into playing, which is a horrible mechanic. Like you should not be doing that. It does work. It makes, but the reason that you use it is to get more sales, not because it actually makes it an engaging experience. But Duo also uses a lot of really good techniques associated with like pathways through material and kind of trying to chart a meaningful course through kind of a learning journey. And it creates all these metaphors about like you've achieved this new like level, you've gotten higher than you ever were before. This symbolizes your achievement. You have done more. Like that kind of messaging is very positive and a good use of game mechanics in that context. So it's really a balancing act, and you want to be very cautious in good gamification not to manipulate your user. Like that's what it is. It's using the classic logics of behavior modification and reward and punishment as a way to force people into certain patterns of behavior, and that I think ethically at least you don't want to do. And even practically, in a lot of contexts, people realize you're doing it, and then they don't like you because you've done it. One of my favorite examples is actually a T&D context where this company that we were working with was trying to get people to complete their sort of optional training programs that they put on this website, this asynchronous training content. And people weren't really engaging with it very much. Like there were some completions, but not a lot. They said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to create an incentive program and we're going to put a leaderboard up. And whoever's at the top of the leaderboard for doing the most training every week or something gets, one, recognized on the leaderboard, and two, I think they got a gift card or something for like coffee, some little reward. And sure enough, the engagement levels went up. There were more people using the software. But when you went into the log data, you said, well, what are people doing? And you found out that there were a lot of completions with a total training time of like 1 minute. Because what people were doing is opening the training and hitting next, submit, and now they're high on the leaderboard. So again, because they're taking advantage of this behavior modification approach, they're just rewarding hitting the finish button. So that's what people do, and they did not realize when they set up the system that that's what would happen. But getting a good understanding of goal setting and the motivational forces in games, you can avoid that kind of pitfall much earlier in the process than they did.
That it definitely makes sense. The way they use like certain gamified techniques. When I was a lifeguard, we had to go through this like American Red Cross, and they gamified that assessment. But I can tell they kind of did what you said and just took the terms and put it in the assessment. And if anything, it made it more annoying. And so I was wondering, is there certain situations that you think where like we shouldn't even be use gamified assessments, and it should in fact just like it's something that you have to do? Or in every scenario, do you think there's a way where we can gamify something to make it more interesting? Because when I was going through that, I was like, get these points away. Let me just go through this reading and like get it over with.
So I think virtually anything can be improved with gamification as a broad concept. So that is to say, what gamification really is or should be is a type of user experience design where you're trying to understand why are people engaging in this system? Why are they doing this assessment? How can we optimize that experience? Where are the confusion points? How can we train them to avoid those confusion points? Like that's what gamification should be. If your question is really more like, can we always throw points at something to make it better? No, we cannot. So there are many basic gamification elements. It's in the industry and in the research kind of disparagingly referred to as PBL, points, badges, and leaderboards. And PBL are the easiest game elements to implement, and they are also the most abused, and they should not be in many situations that they are currently placed into. So yeah, I think gamification can always help, but not necessarily the easy, quick option. It should be more about focusing the design of some system that people are encountering around the person that's going to use it, this user-centered design or UX kind of concept. That's where gamification actually makes a difference.
So when we like talk about all these different types of gamification and the ways that it's effective, I want to kind of tie this back into the consulting that you do. So with the work you're doing, could you walk us through how often you're utilizing these types of concepts in your work, or if you're doing completely different stuff with your consulting, like what, because obviously consulting is a mixed bag, but if you're kind of more gearing towards tech, like you said, is that kind of what you're seeing, like a lot of stuff like this?
So the games area specifically less of. We have done maybe just be like 2 game-based projects where a company is trying to create an assessment or implement some kind of game-based performance management system. Those are the 2 that I remember. And they're not really sure how to do it. Because a lot of the times these are like startup tech firm kind of groups, like little venture capital funded organizations that are saying, we have all these engineers and they can make all these cool systems. How do we make that actually like improve something at a real workplace? And they have a kind of vague idea of how to do it, but they don't have any IOs on the teams. They are just aware that something's missing, that it's not working the way they thought it would work, and they don't know why. Most of my work is actually in the artificial intelligence space, especially because here lately there's been a much greater regulatory focus on how AI is used in hiring. So we've been doing a lot more work with the auditing of AI hiring systems or AI-based hiring systems. And so that's where most of the time has been spent here lately. But it's still that kind of marriage. So the same situation occurs where you have a tech firm or a startup that is like, we're going to revolutionize hiring. And then they implement this thing. And they're like, that didn't work. And they're not sure why. And the reason is often because they just don't have the IO expertise. They have no concept of constructs. They have no concept of measurement. They're just like, I'm going to make this thing that I intuitively think assesses or reflects a person's ability and then give it to them, and it should just work. And it doesn't, or it works kind of badly. One of my favorite actually examples from that is a company that we were working with did coder assessments. They were looking at coding skill through automated web-based AI-driven coding assessments. So it was like you're given a prompt to write a piece of code to do something. And we actually see some of things like that now, actually, even in the IO market. Sometimes people are asked to like do this R problem or Python problem or whatever for people analytics. But so they were doing this through code, and they had this code quality metric, and they were like, yeah, this is great. We use it to assess how well the people are doing. I'm like, well, what is that? Like, where does that number come from? Because you're giving a percentage. Like, why? How can you say code quality is 80%? What does that mean? And I say, oh, well, the way we look at that is we had our coders internally answer this problem for themselves, and we believe they're all experts because they work for us, so why wouldn't they be experts? And then we counted the number of lines it took them to meet the task. That's it. So how many lines did they cram their code into relative to the number that the people in our own company used when they responded to the same prompt? And I said, how does that have anything to do with code quality? That's not how coding works. And they said, yeah, but it's easy to calculate. I'm like, okay, many steps back in this conversation. And so we started talking about constructs and measurements and kind of educating them in basically in IO and in psychometrics. So that's the kind of interaction I have a lot. So working with these tech companies and educating them a little bit on IO practices, and also a bit working with IO companies it's often about conflict with the tech people in their companies. So they'll have, like a 20-person coder development team and a 5-person IO team, and they're just not getting along because they don't speak the same language. And so I'll come in and try to help bridge some gaps between how they're approaching their projects.
That's a perfect example of, I feel like, why companies need IOs. Like if you ever need to tell someone like how is IO useful in the business place, you can kind of give them that example that you just said. But more broadly speaking about just like your work in AI in general, we've had like AI come up so often, I feel like, just in this past year with everything that's coming out. Yeah, I feel like we've probably talked about it before on this podcast, right, Brandon?
Yeah, we talk about it offline a lot too.
Yeah, exactly. Weren't there just aren't they coming out with like some AI hiring laws, or they just passed? Was it in
Mhm.
June or something like that? Or I can't remember.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of initiatives going on right now. Um, so the one that you're thinking of probably is New York.
Mhm.
That's the one that everybody's
I think we learned
talking
in like our
about.
selection class. Yeah.
Yeah, New York passed. Gosh, I think that was maybe January before last. It was supposed to be implemented January of this year, and it got delayed multiple times. And so the implementation date finally was, I think it was in June. So that basically requires, and I mean, this would be, it could be an hour conversation at least about just this law. But they basically said for any automated employment decision tool, and that has a very specific definition, then it's required to have a yearly audit by an independent auditor as to its success. And it basically requires reporting on all of the standard kind of EEOC racial and gender categories and posting that on a website. Like that's the core of the law. But this is the tip of the iceberg. California is currently working on its own AI laws. I know that EEOC is kind of watching what's happening in New York and California, trying to think about how federal regulation is going to be affected. I know there's at least a couple now bipartisan efforts to draft new legislation related to AI in high stakes decision making of all sorts. It's just a lot moving right now. So yeah, very, very active space, and a lot of IOs very worried about it because they're not clear as to whether these new laws generally apply to us or not. Despite the fact that, the core of the problem being that AI at its most fundamental just refers to automation of human decision making through algorithms, which, if you interpret that liberally, includes things like I ran a regression. So is that something we should worry about or not? And it's not very clear yet from law or from the court cases that have come out so far.
To call back to PSYOP, it was I feel like it was almost every session that we were looking around and we were just seeing talking about artificial intelligence or the dangers around it or some of the highlights or all the tech companies that were in the expose room, all those different things that you saw. I feel like it's not just like a buzzword now, it's like screaming at us, and I'm not sure yet. Like Joe and I will talk about this too, because some of the tools that you get from AI automations are great, but you still have to go back and check. And we talk about this on this podcast. This is one of the points on AI is the people utilizing AI are definitely going to have the upper hand when it comes to if you're hiring or in that sphere. But the one thing with that is you still have to have the knowledge to be able to assess the output of what your AI is helping you with, whatever the case is or whatever area that is. So it's interesting to hear that in your field, when you're working on all these different projects or working with probably these AI companies, you're seeing that you have to give them the knowledge to help them build this product. If that sounds correct, that's kind of how I was interpreting it.
Yeah, to do it well, and I work mostly with assessment companies, so in that case, yes. So they're trying to assess human characteristics, and they're not totally sure how to do it. I would say the AI threat to our field is dramatically larger than that, though. I know of products right now, for example, that you can use in an interview context. So say you're interviewing through Zoom or whatever, and it will actually sit there and listen in real time to whatever question your interviewer tells you. It will parse out a good answer based on inputs you've given to it, and then give you a script to read back aloud, all without having to move your eyes very far from the person giving you this interview. This is the kind of product that's being designed right now, and it's going to change a lot once these become mainstream. I mean, we can even think about basic psychometric tests, where right now there's fairly straightforward ways to detect if someone is not really paying attention or is trying to answer in extreme ways so that to get a high score. But what happens when even one person with knowledge of psychometrics helps to build an AI that automatically answers those things in consistent ways with the way they're scored? It's going to be a problem. And I'm not sure what we're going to do about it. And it's, that's easily within 10 years. It may be within 5. So that kind of thing is happening everywhere. And that's simultaneous with the general future of work shifts, where we're now getting AI assistance with work. We are getting new AI-based ways to interact with teams and communicate. We have tools that will watch chats between team members and detect when there's like a difficult relationship between dyads within a team, and then tell their manager, hey, you should pay attention to this. I mean, it is transforming everything about the way work is conducted, at least in situations where data can be collected that way. I don't know how much it's going to change plumbing, but any white collar job, and especially any job where like email or instant messaging is a key part of your dynamic with your team and the leaders in the organization, it's gonna be big very soon.
I utilize an AI tool. Like I use a bunch, but one of them specifically for my work that I want to highlight is like I have a digital note taker, and it just like attends my meetings, and it comes with me, and it will put like summaries, key points, actionable items, and then it'll break down like the way that you're speaking. So it's actually even helped me on this podcast. Like it taught me that I might need to slow down how many words I'm saying per minute.
Does it work well, like in the note-taking department, like the summaries?
It's definitely one of those things that needs some beefing up, but like the summaries have helped a lot. Like because I'll go to a meeting and I'll take my notes still with it, just because like I want to make sure I'm on top of my stuff. And then I'll go back and let's say I need to like provide some sort of deliverable. I can like go back specifically to like what a client said, and I can be like, okay, they said exactly these words. This is exactly what I need to provide, instead of like my words that are like in broken English while I'm writing in the middle of a call. So they're definitely there to help. That's for sure.
The speed of change is the important piece, and that's what people are not ready for this at all. And it's the rapid pace of change that's created the problem. So that product, what you're describing 5 years ago, not many people would imagine that would be where we would be now, because things have moved so much more rapidly in terms of development and the ability of these models to do like really high quality speech to text. That's really the core of this one, in addition to the summary pieces. And that's constantly improving still as these companies get more data to build bigger data sets and build more accurate AIs. And right now we're already in like the 90+% accuracy range. And that just means like every 10 words, one word's going to be kind of weird, or there's going to mangle a phrase or something. But again, 5 years ago, it was like 80%. And then it's kind of hard to even read the content. And 5 years before that, you were lucky if it was even recognizable. So just the pace that this is changing is incredible compared to what we've been doing. And if you can imagine that pace of change 5 years from now, we will be at a point where it will be basically perfect within the next decade, easily. So how will that change everything that relies on text or any sort of tools that could exist, or the companies that are going to pop up trying to take advantage of that? It's just really big. And I don't think we're ready to parse all those changes as a field, maybe even as a society. I don't know, but it's certainly a lot happening very quickly.
It is crazy to think about, and especially just like in your personal life too. Like regardless of like what happens at like organizations, like how AI will like affect what we do on our phone or like on our computer. But you're right. Maybe we'll have to have you come back like in 5 years when AI is like perfect, and we'll be like, we called it.
5 years to the day.
Yeah. But before we go too much over time, we wanted to leave you with one more question for our viewers. If you had one piece of advice to like prospective IO students, or maybe IO students that are currently in a program, what would that be?
Sure. Well, so I will say that I have a slight story to lead into that. So when I started doing technology research in IO, the primary piece of feedback I got was that is not IO. And technology is not relevant to IO psychology. Nothing happening in this space matters to anything we do, because we're talking about people and humans, and that has nothing to do with tech. And over the course of essentially my pre-tenure kind of era, when I was trying to start to establish myself, it was partly through the obvious changes in society at the same time. It was partly because I just would not give up, and a number of other colleagues that I could point to, like frequent co-author of mine, Tara Barron, also had a similar experience. We just kept fighting the fight in order to say, like, no, this is unavoidable. This is something happening, and we have to understand it. And if we don't understand it, it's going to get taken away from us. And now, sure enough, we're seeing a little bit of that. We're seeing that, like, hiring firms appearing in Silicon Valley, where hiring was the domain of IO, and now there are these external forces trying to disrupt these sort of core areas of our field. So my core piece of advice would be that the established older ways of thinking are often sold to us, especially in graduate programs, as fact. Like that they are simple tenets of how IO psychology works, of how organizations function. But all of this is in motion. Everything is constantly changing, and we react to society changing just as much as we hope to contribute and to meaningfully understand it and alter practices. So, if you have a deeply held belief related to the future of work, and somebody tells you nobody's going to care about that doesn't make any sense, that's not a reason to abandon it. There's an important element of tenacity and believing in yourself. It doesn't mean like hold on to it when you have evidence to the contrary, but in these areas where we don't really know what's going to happen, and you see a path and you see a meaningful way forward, you see a way that consulting could be changed, or you can imagine a product that would really change the way that we do our basic IO practices, or whatever it is, that it's important not to give up on that in the face of opposition from those much older and maybe or maybe not wiser than you. So having a willingness to persist in that situation, I think is just absolutely critical, and something that I hope everyone coming up in IO right now, I mean everywhere, but especially IO coming up right now, really holds to.
That's great advice, and we haven't really had advice like that on this show yet. So first time for that, which is great. But I want to go back to your point, Richard, about what you were saying about staying strong with if you have something and you're seeing a trend, because I like to use this analogy. I've talked about it with a few people away from this podcast about the way to look at it is from a mountain. Someone from a mountain can see everything, but I'm still traveling up to the top. So I'm my perspective is a little more detailed. I might be missing a few things from the outside, but they're seeing everything above. And I guess the point from that is when you're in the details and you're looking through, especially when you're in grad school, because we get pretty heavy into the research or we get heavy into the practice, and you start seeing things and trends that a lot of people who've been doing things the way they have been for a long time might miss, because they just their automatic response, their responses are automated. They're going to go into work and do what they do every day because they know what they're doing. While you have this fresh mind of reading the research and learning and adjusting and growing. Stay strong with those convictions, because it could be something that could be pivotal for our field, and it could help grow the field even more.
Yeah, I think the core thing to remember is that we're about evidence, and that should be the core value that we bring to these situations. So when you look at the changes that are happening right now due to technology or whatever else, if there's no evidence against this being real and you see a trajectory for it, you can't just assume that it won't be. There's a wonderful paper called Fads, Fashion, and Falderall, Marv Denad, an old paper, about how in IO and business, we often do have these things that are temporary and not very real, multiple names for the same idea, all of these concepts. That's important. There are certainly new technologies that will appear and new practices that will appear that are either not really different from what we were already doing, or just more or less smoke and mirrors as to being something truly new. One of the earliest technologies I studied was virtual worlds in Second Life, which in 2004, we were studying the metaverse in 2004, 2005. And as it turned out, 2004, 2005, world was not ready for the metaverse. Turns out 2022, 2023, probably still not really ready for the metaverse. The tech just isn't really there yet. So it is important to pay attention to that. But if you don't have evidence that this is not where things are going, it's still worth understanding. It's still worth being a part of the conversations related to, well, what does this mean about how we change things? And a lot of people will resist that just because it's all they know. I mean, the major conversation I've had with academics about ChatGPT is, how do we stop students from using ChatGPT? That should not be the conversation. The conversation should be, well, these kind of generative AI models are going to be a part of their work lives. It's going to be a part of how they approach everything if they're useful. So how can we take advantage of that? How do we integrate it into the classroom experience? How do we ensure that people are learning how to be productive with these new technologies, rather than just say, ooh, new, scary, We don't want this thing. Like there's a lot of baked in resistance to change. And that's the thing you can't let drive you and change your direction. It doesn't mean don't pay attention to evidence that something's bad or wrong. What it means is, in the absence of evidence, don't assume that the old way is necessarily the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. From one of the most important things we heard at SAB was that AI won't take things away, but it'll just change them. And so be a part of that change and like embrace adapting to these new situations will help not like just get you to the know-how of AI, but actually kind of like put you on top and be like, I can use these tools to my advantage. And it will be interesting to see in the next 5 years, like how we get to use these tools in our everyday life. But overall, great advice. I like the part, it's kind of like follow your passion. Like if you didn't follow your passion in tech and games and Gamified, you wouldn't be doing the research today. And if we listen to those people, so it's wonderful advice. And especially for students upcoming who want to participate in research, if you find a part of research that you like, go for it. There's no harm being done. But thank you, Richard, for coming on today and discussing about your life and your research. It was super cool to hear about everything. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much. Yeah, it was super fun. Thanks.
Yeah. Take care. Wow. So that was a great episode with Richard. I feel like there are probably 4 or 5 topics that we touched on in that episode that we could have done our own podcast episode on for this time.
Yeah, I know we kind of like wanted this. I think I even said like to get to the bulk of the episode about the consulting firm, and then we ended off like AI. But I mean, I have no complaints. He's of course super knowledgeable in the field. So just hearing him talk about AI and selection and those sorts of topics was really interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of funny too. Like Joe and I have talked about this, and I may have mentioned it at the beginning of the show, but we did read one of his gamification articles when we were in class. So to kind of like have that come full circle now, and for us to see him here, and Joe and I actually did appear on an episode of his podcast. So all these things come in full circle for us today.
It was like talking to a local IO celebrity.
Oh yeah, 100%.
But we want to thank you guys for listening. We really hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll hope to see you next week.
Yeah, see you guys next week.